Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Good to be back with you all today. It is just, as I said in the sanctuary, my heart is just full. It's been such a wonderful weekend, getting to know your congregation and hear your voices, hear the amazing things you're doing, hear your concerns and your worries and your wonderings, many of which I share and have occasion to think about as I am going about my teaching and speaking life through the seminary. Last night, yesterday we talked about Christian nationalism in the morning. We were here with some of the leadership last night thinking about how do we navigate this divided times for the church. And this morning, I want to think about, polarization and how we navigate that just in our broader life as citizens in a society that some of which is Christian, some of which is not. And how do we, particularly as Christians, navigate it faithfully? How do we survive an election year with our souls intact? You may have heard it's an election year. It's our every 4-year ritual marked by rising anxiety and vitriol and uncertainty. In recent years, election years have brought a lot of anxiety. Will the Republic survive this election? Are people that we once thought of as our neighbors really our enemies? There's a lot at stake in this election. Part of the rationale for the series that Jane mentioned that I led at the seminary, part of the rationale for it was the rising anxiety and uncertainty about, does democracy have a future in our country? I had the opportunity and continue to have the opportunity to talk to all kinds of folks who are navigating these uncertain times. As Jay mentioned, folks in media, folks in government, folks in the church. And I think the concerns are widely shared that there are, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, that maybe the Republic has never been entirely secure. We've always had to work to preserve and sustain it. And there are dangers to our democracy, I think, abroad in the land these days. But there are also dangers to our souls as we navigate an election season. And I want to think with you a little bit today about those and how we can navigate them gracefully and faithfully. We live in an era marked by what scholars are calling hyper-polarization. Hyper-polarization, a time when fears and tensions are peaking. I think it's important. History can remind us that, sometimes the word unprecedented gets overused. Maybe we're not living in unprecedented times. Maybe that's too strong. We fought a civil war in this country. So unprecedented may be too strong, but it's not so much relief to remember that we fought a civil war when we learn that today, this slide is showing more than 40% of Americans say it is, quote, very likely, or at least, quote, somewhat likely, that there will be a second civil war in the next 10 years. Even if not a full-blown civil war, so many folks are worried about the possibility of political violence. The existential dread of political violence or civil war springs from clear and measurable realities on the ground. The nation's two major political parties have become much more starkly divided down ideological lines in recent decades. And as that has happened, mistrust has deepened. One 2021 survey found that 60% of Democrats now regard the Republican Party as, quote, a serious threat to the United States, while fully 70% of Republicans regard the Democratic Party as a serious threat to the United States. It's hardly a surprise that the attribution of lots of other negative traits follows from those kind of global generalizations. The rate at which Republicans and Democrats have thought of one another as closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, unintelligent, and lazy has skyrocketed just since 2016. Politics, in many ways, has become a kind of national religion, a phenomenon hastened along by the declining strength of religious institutions themselves. Polarization, this hyper-polarization that I'm talking about, is helping to drive an ongoing restructuring of American religion. I know many of you have heard of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, that's what we call folks who don't name a religious affiliation when they're surveyed. These are not necessarily folks who are atheists or secular, but they don't identify with a church. They don't identify with a denomination. And this group has grown remarkably in recent decades. I don't know how well you can see this, but The top line here is folks who identify with Christianity, and just as recently as 2007, 78% of Americans did. In 21, it was 63%. So a really precipitous decline. At the same time, a 13% increase in folks identifying as the nuns. A lot of folks think that, in the next 20 or so years, the nuns might be in the majority in the United States. And polarization is one aspect that's sort of driving this change. It's also a change. This is a chart it's broken down. Again, the words are hard to read, but at the top you have the silent generations, a generational breakdown. Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z. The blue is Protestants, so the folks that identify with the kind of tradition of this church. Orange is Catholic, red is other religion. You can see that, and then nothing in particular is 26.1%. So you can see the silent generation, most people identify with something. As you go down and you get younger and younger, the folks who don't identify are disproportionately young folks. And lots of studies indicating, and I see this at the seminary, that young people's disenchantment with the churches has a lot to do with the nature of their engagement in public life. One 2023 Pew study found that a major driver of growth in the nuns is dissatisfaction with religious organizations, with how these institutions actually live their faith on a day-to-day basis. Fully 47% of nuns see faith-based institutions in a negative light. And they're not alone. I mentioned this last night, that pastors are resigning and considering resigning in higher than usual numbers. And one of the top 3 reasons is polarization. So this is a phenomenon that affects our democracy. It affects our churches. Why is it that our circles are growing narrower? Why are so many of us these days increasingly inclined to see some of our neighbors as our enemies? And as Christians who are called to love our neighbors and our enemies, why are we so often caught in the act of narrowing Jesus' great commandment? If someone came from another planet and landed in the U.S. these days, I'm worried that they might believe the commandment read something like, love your like-minded neighbor as yourself. I want to think a little bit with you about the sources of this hyperpolarization that we're experiencing and how we can navigate it, especially during an election season when everything is so intense. How do we navigate with our souls intact? First, I want to talk about the sources. As I mentioned at the outset, our parties have become much more ideologically divided. In the mid-20th century, for a variety of reasons I'm not going to get down into the weeds on, the Democratic and Republican parties were kind of unwieldy organizations. The Democrats, for example, included most white northern working class folks, most black Americans, and most white Southerners. This was hardly a party that reflected a kind of coherent ideological vision. Part of what happened in the civil rights era was the realignment of parties, the massive restructuring of kind of partisan life in the United States. And we emerge on the other side of the civil rights era with parties that actually do reflect a more coherent ideological vision. And those visions were further apart than they had been at mid-century. So in part what we're dealing with when we talk about hyperpolarization is just a reality, the structure of the political party system in the United States. That's one factor. Another big factor, and we've kind of been talking around this all weekend, is the hollowing out of mediating institutions. It used to be that folks would surely have their affiliation with a political party, but they'd also belong to a lot of other organizations. The Rotary Club. You go to Rotary, and there you were sitting around the table and with all different kinds of folks. Local congregations often played this kind of role. Part of what we're experiencing, the nuns phenomenon, is not only about churches. It's really about a whole way of relating to institutions. And so these mediating institutions, often local, community-based institutions, are struggling to bring people in. And so people aren't interacting around tables nearly as often with folks who see the world differently than they are. And part of what that's driving is something that folks call the big sort. You've probably heard of the big sort. This is this idea that on so many fronts as we look around us, again, politics has become a kind of governing identity for most of us. It's driving, for example, where we live. Americans increasingly are moving to live near people who think the way they do and who vote the way they do. A recent piece on this so-called big sort said this, quote, red zip codes are getting redder, and blue zip codes are becoming bluer. The number of super landslide counties, these are ones where a presidential candidate won at least 80% of the vote, jumped from 6% in 2004 to 22% in 2020. Fascinatingly, as one analyst pointed out, it's not only sort of geography, but it's sort of also the consumer geography. So Biden in 2020 won 85% of counties with a Whole Foods, and only 32% of counties with a Cracker Barrel. Politics drives not only where we live, but where we shop. And increasingly, folks are living alongside folks that they agree with. They're worshiping alongside folks that they agree with. They're shopping alongside folks that they agree with. And all of that, and I want to spend a little bit of time with this one, is being hastened along by major changes in our media environment. Some of you remember the days when Walter Cronkite reigned supreme on the airwaves as the anchorman of CBS News over the course of the 1960s and 1970s, another turbulent season, by the way, in American life. Cronkite was known as, quote, the most trusted man in America. We can now look back on that period, those kind of middle decades of the 20th century, a heyday for network news, as in retrospect, an exception to the American rule. Back in the 19th century, in the late 1800s, American journalism was very diffuse, and people bought penny papers that reflected all different kinds of perspectives and that would have had all different kinds of ideas and political points of view. The Cronkite era, this kind of era of consensus news, was an exception at its time, and it didn't last forever. We first got cable news, now the rise of the internet and social media, with so many folks, especially younger folks, getting their news these days from TikTok. Maybe older folks from Facebook. Twitter, or I don't even know all the new things that are coming out these days, so I'm probably behind. Whatever your point of view is these days, you can find a channel or a site that suits you. This media smorgasbord isn't making us better educated or more well-rounded, importantly. We're drawn to those news outlets that tell us what we want to hear, and the problem for believers like ourselves is that when we get sucked into these highly polarized media worlds, we can easily end up, I think this is key, this is relating this to our faith, we end up believing and bearing false witness against our neighbors, sometimes even without meaning to. In an excellent book, Why We Are Polarized, Ezra Klein writes about how the more political media that folks consume, not the more educated they become, the more warped their perspective on their neighbors often becomes. So he says this, quote, Democrats believe 44% of Republicans earned over $250,000 a year. It's actually 2%. Republicans believe that 38% of Democrats were gay, lesbian, or bisexual. The correct answer is about 6%. Democrats believe that more than 4 out of every 10 Republicans are seniors. In truth, seniors make up about 20% of the GOP. Republicans believe that 46% of Democrats are black and 44% belong to a union. In reality, about 24% of Democrats are African American and less than 11% belong to a union. You might think, well, if consuming political media in this hyper-polarized media environment isn't helping us, maybe we just need to get outside of our echo chambers. What if we expand the kind of media that we consume? Then surely we'll end up with a clearer-eyed view of our neighbors. But in our highly polarized social media world, this doesn't work either. There's studies that show, Klein cites this study in which Republicans who followed a liberal bot online became more conservative. And Democrats who followed a conservative bot online became more liberal. Consuming media from the other side doesn't engage us in a deeper way. It confirms our sense that we're right and how wrong they are. So what's happening? There are major shifts afoot in the ways that our identities are formed and activated. And this media environment is a big piece of this. As humans, we have all kinds of identities. I'm a Christian, I'm a historian, I'm an author, a husband, a father, Kansas City football fan, a United States citizen, etc., a child of the 1980s. I could go on, right? It used to be that most of our identities weren't especially polarized or polarizing. It was just part of an interesting fact about who you are that you might share in an icebreaker kind of situation. Being an NFL fan or a Whole Foods shopper was just that. It was an interest. It was a preference, which might combine with almost any other kind of political or ideological outlook. But increasingly, in this media environment that we're all swimming in, our political identities are becoming mega identities, which swallow up all other aspects of our lives. The NFL is an interesting example. As many of you will be familiar with the Colin Kaepernick protests in the interest of racial justice, this became a deeply polarizing moment in the history of the NFL. Before the protests, 60% of both Clinton and Trump voters viewed the NFL favorably. After, its favorability among Trump voters plummeted to 30%. Then Nike made Kaepernick its spokesperson, and so Nike's favorability rose with some constituencies and fell with other constituencies. So you can see how things that aren't on the face of them necessarily political get swallowed up. And it's not just the NFL, it's lattes and sushi and the New York Times, and it's Chick-fil-A and Cracker Barrel and Fox News and country music. More and more, our whole lives are swallowed up by political mega identities. And social media accelerates this process, offering endless opportunities to identify with something and to flaunt that identity. Klein writes, one of BuzzFeed's most popular series was X things only a Y would understand. A Google search for these keywords brings up articles like 14 things only anxious people will understand, 19 things only people with fibromyalgia will understand, 53 things only 80s girls can understand. Many of these articles are in good fun. I really liked one a few years ago that pinpointed me as a member of the Oregon Trail generation. Not quite too young for Gen X, too old to be a true millennial. But there are darker sides to the ways that social media mobilizes our identity. It can be easy to fall down rabbit holes on sites like YouTube, which seeks to draw its users deeper into the things they're already interested in. Here's Klein again. Videos about vegetarianism led to videos about veganism. Videos about jogging led to videos about running ultramarathons. It's one thing when you're interested in vegetarianism or jogging, quite another when you're interested in politics. On YouTube and TikTok and countless other sites, folks can fall deep into rabbit holes that end up radicalizing them in one direction or another and leading them to readily dismiss those who don't already agree with their views. And it goes without saying that this media environment is very profitable. It's very profitable. So, here we are, swimming in this media environment, swimming in this hyper-polarized environment. What can we do? How do we survive this time with our souls intact? I'm going to get as practical as a historian can get, and we'll see how it goes. One thing I think, and I think this is really good to do in an election year, is to practice mindful scrolling. Part of what happens when you're online is you can lose time on there, right? And it's easy to just, and you start, and along the way, you're feeling things. And you may not even notice it, but you might start feeling a little angry, you might start feeling a little sad, you might start feeling, and oftentimes we don't even pay attention, right? We're just scrolling through, but we're interacting with all kinds of content that's giving us all kinds of responses. So one thing to do, I think this is actually a really hard thing to do for more than like 15 minutes, because I think it's actually designed to get us to mindlessly scroll. But if you can, try for 15 minutes or 30 minutes or 45 minutes one day to be really mindful as you're engaged online. What feelings or emotions are coming up for you? What content are you finding yourself drawn to and repelled from? Is the source reliable? How is it making you feel about that person you already are a little bit irritated with? How is it making you feel about your neighbor? Practice mindful scrolling. I don't think this is going to get us all the way out, right, of this kind of immersive media environment, but it's worth giving it a go. Sometimes it's good to just take a break. That could be another thing to do, right, as we head through this intense season, is to take a break from it altogether. I think it's really hard to do the mindful scrolling thing. It can also be hard in an election season to invest in bridges. What do I mean by bridges? My friend Cherie Harder, who's president of the Trinity Forum in DC, recently said on a panel I moderated that, quote, "In culture wars, as in land wars, the bridges are the first thing to go." The big sort that I mentioned earlier means that we're losing one of the key brakes on a deep-seated human tendency to demonize others who don't look like us or vote like us. And that break is human relationships, especially cross-cutting relationships. It used to be that our lives were full of relationships that cut across our different identities. That's what we've lost or are losing. So many of our relationships are with people who share many of our views and many of our identities. This is a time during election season when there's going to be a lot of money made and a lot of hay made of emphasizing differences, and differences that really matter. Like I said, don't forget, there are real dangers afoot in this season. And also, this is a time to lean in to those cross-cutting relationships that can feel especially fraught during a time like this. Be intentional about showing love to someone who thinks differently than you. Be intentional about spending time with them. There's a lot of stuff you can read in the media. Oh, run away. Don't engage across lines of difference. I think that's the wrong thing to do if we're going to keep our souls intact. I think there are ways to actually lean into these relationships even when it's hard. I know I've experienced this in my own life, the value of these kind of cross-cutting relationships. I mentioned this to some of you folks yesterday. The two top pictures are me in college, on the left here, on the left in this one. And these are two really recent photos with two of my very best friends who were folks when I met them who could not have thought about the world more differently than me. And I learned so much from them. And they loved me, even though I thought all kinds of terrible things that were wrong, I now think, when I first met these guys. And yet they somehow loved me, and their friendship made such a difference in my life. And it wasn't like they were trying to save me or to change my mind or anything. They just were my friends, and I learned so much from them along the way. I really think, with some exceptions, that there are some bad faith actors abroad in the land, right? But a lot of folks are not bad faith actors. A lot of folks are good faith actors. Find ways to lean into those cross-cutting relationships. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this. It's a chart that underscores that this is something that's not very popular right now. It's a kind of trend on both the left and the right, people wanting to live by folks that agree with them and wanting to be friends with folks that agree with them. It's really critical that my closest friends and maybe my wider network be people who think like I am. It is still possible, though, to lean into bridges, to invest in bridges, to lean into cross-cutting relationships. Usually it's not good to begin with, hi, I'm Heath, and this is what I believe, and I'm looking for a friend who believes differently. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. Usually it probably begins, as we talked about a little bit yesterday, by embracing curiosity and generosity toward others. This is not going to be a season flush with curiosity and generosity. But we can embrace curiosity and generosity. It'll take work. We have to remind one another from time to time. We can do it. We can do it. And it's, I think, a way to faithfully navigate this season with our souls intact. Not everybody has to be a bridge builder. Not everybody has to make it their life work to forge all kinds of relationships across lines of difference. If you're not a bridge builder, here's something you can do. Cheer on the bridge builders. Cheer on the people in your life who are good at this and who do find it's helpful and meaningful. We're living in a moment where not only is it hard to build bridges, and some folks say, that's not what I'm about, but bridge builders are under attack right now, and it's hard work to build bridges in a season like this. It's going to be really especially hard in an election season to be a bridge builder. So when you see someone else in your life who's doing the small things to reach out beyond their own circles, cheer them on. It's a really, I think, beautiful way to, again, if that's not your personal thing, if that's not your personal gift, you say, I'm just too exhausted or overwhelmed, or I'm too traumatized by relationships that I've had in the past that have really left me in a position I can't do this work. Cheer on folks who are doing it in your midst. I think it's important to say, I love This Little Light of Mine. It was a beautiful song. I grew up with it in Sunday school. I learned in graduate school that it was a civil rights anthem Fannie Lou Hamer's remarkable black woman activist lifted up that song at key moments in the struggle. I think part of what I want to say to you today is to navigate this election season with our souls. In fact, it means that partly you've got to remain rooted in Jesus Christ, remain rooted in the generous, joyful gospel that's proclaimed in a place like LOPC. Don't hide your light under a bushel. It's not, in order to build bridges and embrace generosity and curiosity, it doesn't require you to set aside everything you believe. Remain rooted in that. And out of that strength, extend generosity. Sometimes elusiveness is a good thing. This is something that is also true. I mean, don't hide your light under a bushel. You don't have to say what you think at every moment. Sometimes, it's a beautiful thing to just listen, and it's a beautiful thing to show grace when someone says something you find objectionable, but it's not the moment, right? So sometimes elusiveness can be a way that we find our way through a season like this one. But in general, let your light shine in your personal relationships, in your congregation. Don't suppress the important stuff. Don't avoid important topics. Don't feel like you have to create some imaginary middle ground where you really disagree, or so you really agree but you don't. You can be a person of good faith and generosity who's really beautifully rooted in what you believe, but also deeply committed to generosity, curiosity. Take the long view sometimes. Sometimes. There's an urgency to now, rightfully so. We do worship a God who we believe is sovereign over history, and that's something that Christians can take with us into a season like this one, that we have hope. We're not people driven by fear, but by hope. It's good to take the long view sometimes. It's important, I think, about the long view partly, in that kind of eternal sense. I also think about it in a more immediate sense. This is a really tough time for institutions. And institutions are remarkable. I think they're really important. There's a lot of skepticism of them today, and rightfully so, because a lot of our institutions haven't been delivering on their promise, both church and state and everything beyond. But institutions are so important, and they are what help us to have transgenerational projects, right? To pass on our faith through the generations, to pass on a democracy through the generations. There's going to be a lot of bombs lobbed in an election season, but where you can, cheer on the leaders who are acting in good faith in these times. Shore up local institutions in your community. Shore up institutions that are helping to keep our national life just and fair. I believe in institutions. Take the long view, remember that God's in control, and also continue to invest in the long, slow work of building durable institutions. Be a place, be a people that stoke hopes for transformation. One of the things that happens in a hyper-polarized environment is we really come to believe this thing that I think is really not Christian. It's that person who we find so objectionable will never change. We already know them. We already know what they're about. We don't need to know them. We can dismiss them. We can shame them. We can shun them. Those are beliefs that I think don't comport well with keeping our souls intact in a season like this one. It can be really hard, but I think the grace that I hope we can show, the stoking of hopes for transformation, begins with the realization that God isn't done with us yet either. God's not done with me yet either. I think in terms of stoking hopes for transformation, I want to kind of end with this stuff and then open it out to you all. Couple things. Civically, really interesting thing that has gotten some press in recent years. This new strategy, canvassing, political canvassing, used to be all about turnout, and it was all about, you don't knock on the doors of people that see the world differently. You knock on the doors of people that agree with you, and you get them to show up. There's a new strategy that I'm really fascinated by, thinking about, again, how do we participate in our civic life? How do we stoke hopes that people can change their minds? It's called deep canvassing. It's being worked out across the country right now by organizations that say, we don't want to just do the turnout thing. We want to do a deeper kind of engagement in our civic life. And so what they'll do, this is remarkable to me, they'll knock on any door and they'll stay for up to half an hour. And I mean, you're talking about immigration activists who will knock on the door as someone who has an anti-immigrant sign in their yard, or folks who are working on all kinds of different campaigns that'll knock on the doors of people you would think, that's not the door I want to knock on. They'll have a conversation, and what do they do in these conversations? If you come at someone head on, you're going to get they're going to get a forceful response, right? So what do? They engage people's stories. They get to know them. Part of the idea with this kind of whole idea of deep canvassing is that most people have a side B. Most people have another thing, another experience that in some ways cuts against what they'll tell you they believe. They may be anti-immigrant, but they have a dear friend who's got an immigration story. They may think that government programs are terrible, but their sister is benefited from them, right? And so if you run into the brick wall, part of what these folks who are engaged in this deep canvassing work will do is ask a question like, have you ever had a time in your life where you struggled? And what they find, stoking hopes for transformation, right? People don't change their minds at their doorstep in 30 minutes, but it kind of unsettles the ground a little bit. We can all do this work in our civic life. Ask questions that unsettle the ground a little bit. Sometimes if you come straight at people with every deepest conviction you've ever had, you're going to run into a brick wall. And sometimes if you ask them a question, suddenly the soil's a little looser. I was amazed with Karen Olivito. She was in a conversation that I facilitated last year about how does the church navigate a divided time. Bishop Karen was the first openly queer bishop in the United Methodist Church, and she had, in the course of her leadership in that church, experienced a lot of really, really painful stuff. Her colleagues, refusing to sign her letter of commissioning to be a bishop. Congregations where she would show up just to pray with the congregation and half the congregation walked out while she was praying. Really deep, painful stuff. And I mean, honestly, this is one of the most profound 30 seconds of any conversation that I had a couple of years ago. We were in this conversation, it was Karen, it was in an exchange with a pastor who was saying, we really need the church to be committed in lockstep to kind of particular ways of being in the world. And if people aren't with us, they're against us. And Karen said, I bear the scars on my body of having people around me who disagreed with me and found me actually to not be suited for leadership. And then she went on to say, maybe you've heard about what's happening in the Methodist Church right now, which is major divisions over human sexuality, and the church is moving forward in a progressive vein. Conservatives are leaving, and it was fascinating. It was right in the middle of that whole situation. She said, but I lament that the conservatives are leaving the church. She said, because they need to be transformed. And then she paused, and then she said, but I need to be transformed too. And that's what the Holy Spirit can do. And so we need each other. Even when we cause each other pain, we need each other, and we need to hold out hope for transformation. So, can LOPC be a place during an election season that at once stands strong, rooted in Christ, proclaiming a generous, joyful, justice-seeking faith, and also finds ways to love folks when they're wrong, and finds ways to stoke hopes for transformation of ourselves, of our local communities, of our nation, of our world? If you do, and even if you don't, but if you do, if you lean into that, you'll not only survive this election season with your souls intact, but contribute to God's glory and neighbor's good along the way. May it be so.